Mr. Chairman and members of the board, you also asked for some information about fund balances and revenue stabilization fund at your last meeting, so I'll begin to address those now. Well, in a minute. Yes. And I got the controls here, right? Okay. So I'll begin to address some of those questions along with Ms. Joanne Carter, who has joined us today. She is our financial advisor with the firm PFM. They have been our financial advisors since 2001, so over 12 years, and been very involved in our bond issuances of over $650 million. Specifically, you were asking for some information about what our current balances are, why they are at the levels they're at, why they even matter, and what other jurisdictions reserve and how we compare to some of those other jurisdictions. I'm going to begin with our principles of sound financial management because they have, in fact, guided our financial management of the county for over the past 2 decades. They were originally adopted in '88, and we've updated them a number of times over the years, and most recently you once again unanimously adopted them in 2012. With regard to fund balance, it's a very important measure in every way, shape, and form. It is the net financial resources that's available at the end of each fiscal year to fund the county operations, county services. And so it truly is a measure of our financial health. It measures the strength and stability of Prince William County, or any government for that matter. Which is why, no surprise, that the rating agencies look at it so closely, evaluate it as they evaluate our overall economic health and our overall credit. I want to zero in a little bit on the unassigned fund balance and then the revenue stabilization reserve that we have in place. And the unassigned fund balance is the amount of money, we used to refer to this as the unreserved, undesignated. It's available for appropriation at any point in time. But it is truly for emergency purposes. It's not a rainy day fund. It is a worst case scenario fund. That's how we look at it. It's the fund balance that we have by our own principles say as that we will maintain at 7.5% of our revenues, which is currently, the balance is currently about $64 million. And later on in the agenda, when you go through the year-end information, it will have to increase to $66 million to maintain it at that 7.5% level. Not surprisingly also, it has been a major factor in the rating agencies upgrading us because we were able to adhere to this policy through the worst of the recession. We were upgraded to AAA by Moody's in 2010. We were upgraded by S&P in 2011. And we have established quite a bit of credibility with the firms and the financial markets because we not only have these principles in place, but we actually adhere to them, good times and bad. With regard to our revenue stabilization reserve, this is the reserve that we require to keep at least 1% of general revenue. So this is a layer on top of our unassigned fund balance. And this is a layer that we have used for planning purposes and for working capital, and it's also would be what would be available for economic shocks if we were to experience them once again. Some of this gets to be a little technical, but it's not some place we would look to go to immediately if we had a fiscal downturn, an economic shock. That's where that 3% comes in. 3% of current revenues would be about $28 million. And so what we're saying here is if the general revenues were affected by as much as $28 million, well, then we would go here. And that's a significant threshold. We didn't want to go there originally because what we would first look to do would be to correct the structural imbalance in our budget. Back in 2007, we had to do just that. When it became apparent that the economy was turning in a different direction, the board amended the budget down by $18.1 million in April of 2007. And so we never went to the revenue stabilization reserve at that point in time because it would have been a one-time fix. Instead, we went through quite a process to reduce government. There were many RIFs involved and many program cuts across the board so that we could keep our budget in balance, not only for fiscal '07, but then going forward into fiscal '8, '9, and '10, because it was becoming more and more apparent that this would not just be a short-term event. So that's why that 1% is in there. Now, I want to take a look also at the history of our fund balance over quite a period of time. This begins back in 1986. There's a big gap here to fit it all on the screen. There wasn't anything really significant happening between '89 and '99. But you can see that we are doing pretty well right now, but we didn't always walk the walk. In fact, if you zero in on this time frame back in '87, '88, and '89, in 1988, fund balance was entirely depleted to provide for a one-time tax rate reduction. And you can see the tax rate was reduced from $1.42 to $1.30 for 1 year. Average tax bills decreased by about 1.6%. Now, that coincides, that 1988 coincides with our first road bond referendum. We were issuing GO bonds for the schools, and the rating agencies, in no uncertain terms, spoke to us about either address this situation or we will be downgrading you, which at that time would have been to single A. So it was a pretty clear message that was received by the board and the county at that point in time. In fact, the next year you can see the rate was increased to $1.38, which had quite a whipsaw impact on average tax bills to begin to get the balance back to a more appropriate level. There were quite a few lessons learned through that process. In 1988, as I mentioned earlier, was when our principles of sound financial management were first adopted in connection with this whole the time frame and the events that were unfolding. In 1989, the board adopted the Financial and Program Planning Ordinance. And then I mentioned also in 1988, we also had our first road bond referendums. Those were important issues to address as we were going to begin to grow and issue more bond financing for more infrastructure, and to issue at single A would have been a very different interest impact than double A or now triple A. I need to go back one slide. Back to this slide here. Clearly, we received the message and we began a long process to bring our fund balance back in line. It's over 2 decades, again, of traveling this, a very disciplined approach to our financial management practices.
I wish Sean had been here for that chart, by the way.
And you can see we were rewarded along the way with the higher credit rating. Now, there's another thing that we've overlaid here. In 2004, we began to set aside what we referred to as the revenue stabilization. It was not policy at the time, but it became extremely clear to us that we were in an economic environment that was not sustainable. Housing values could not continue to appreciate by 17% a year. And I remember standing in front of you saying, we're at 17% this year, but we're projecting a lesser amount in future years, 8 and 4, and then lower amounts in all of our forecasts, because we didn't believe it was sustainable. And so we were setting this aside to help us deal with whatever was coming around the corner. We adopted that as formal policy when you adopted the principal update in 2009. So it wasn't formal policy until we got over here into 2009. And that's where we are today, which then gets us to, here's a look at the revenue stabilization reserve balances that were adopted in the 5-year plan this past April. You can see that we, in 2014, are beginning the year at $27 million, and we are projecting to end it at $34.9 million. In fact, we're adding to it in 14 and 15. We're doing that for a couple of reasons. First of all, you have some significant capital projects that are going to be under construction, and they will be coming online in 16 and 17. And when they come online, of course, the debt service will be fully online, and the operating costs will be fully online. And so those monies that we're setting aside in 14 and 15, we are using in 16 and 17 to help smooth out those projects coming online. So we don't have spikes and valleys in our budget. We're also adjusting to the lower tax policy guidance that you've provided. So we had a plan in place for an average tax bill to go up by 4%, and now from this point forward, we're at 2.5%. And so this is also helping us smooth out the bumps as we travel that road. And then the other purpose for this reserve is always any external economic shocks that we may need to deal with, whether they're coming out of the federal government in the form of sequestration, or whether they're coming from Richmond in the form of VRS impacts, or whatever they may be. So that's a look at the fund balances and our principles and why we are doing what we're doing. I want to move on to introduce Joanne Carter. Are there any questions on anything here, Mr. Chairman?
Any questions for Mr. Martino?
Just thank you very much. Very good information, Mr. Martino. I really appreciate you coming here and explaining this to us. If you can just go back to slide 5, I think, just to help educate myself. I won't say we, but just help educate myself. Where did the 7.5% and the 1% benchmarks come from? Is that something that the rating agency said that that's a target that they would like for localities to maintain? And I guess a follow-up question to that, is that adopted board policy of 7.5% and 1%?
Let me take it in reverse order. It is adopted board policy in the principles of sound financial management. We brought that to the board for adoption with the guidance that we received directly from the rating agencies, from our financial advisors, and from what we read and keep up to date on in the Government Finance Officers Association. The guidance, general guidance, used to be along the lines of 5 to 10%, which is how we got to 7.5%. More recently, the guidance is calling for more than that. But that's how we got to those figures. And the reason, one of my personal frustrations, when we had in place over here the unassigned fund balance, and we were making progress during the good economic times to that 7.5% level. But that's a level, as I mentioned earlier, not for working capital. It's really for the worst case scenario emergencies. So that if we were to utilize that to smooth out our budget planning, well then that would have repercussions with the rating agencies and the financial markets. So my frustration was we didn't have that level above it, however small it is, to actually manage through financial planning, because we're going to have large capital projects in 1 year come online, and then we won't. And those are the kind of things that led us to, along with the rating agencies and our financial advisors, to developing that next level, the 1% stabilization reserve.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just ask one follow-up, please. Would it be your recommendation that the board reevaluate that 1% to increase it of the revenue stabilization? Since it looks like we consistently maintain more than 1% within that revenue stabilization, would it be beneficial to actually codify that into board policy to maintain? I mean, since if you go to the next slide, or that one, it talks about right now, if I'm reading this correctly, our revenue stabilization fund is at 3.73%.
That's correct. It's going up to 3.8, but then it's coming down to under 2%, 1.75. And in fact, if we were to carry this out, I would expect that to come closer. We're working into that 1% level. This was built up as we're coming out of the recession, number one, and then number two, knowing that we put a lot more capital projects online than we had in our plan just this past year, never mind 2 years ago. So that's why the numbers got as high as they did. Long term, I don't expect that we'd be maintaining at that level. With regard to codifying it, I think you have, it's in your principles of sound financial management that we'll have a 1% minimum, and then, to the extent it makes sense for these kind of, to address these kind of issues, it could be more.
I guess my question was, is do you think the minimum needs to be higher?
Go back, Mr. Martino, to that point, if you go back to the previous slide, I think it's a very good question. No, that slide there. I think, if you permit me, I think what you're telling us now is we maintain an extra large revenue stabilization fund because the housing market collapsed. We get most of our revenues from property tax revenues. Some of the instability in the economy nationally seems to have subsided, and there's more stability. So it's no longer necessary to carry such an extra large revenue stabilization fund.
That's correct. I think what I'm hearing is we think we've come through the recession, and we think that would be going down. I don't think I would raise it too much higher. I think a 1% minimum provides a sufficient floor to this whole thing. Now, you can always include more in it as you adopt a 5-year plan each year. And then maybe Ms. Carter can address that in a little bit more detail, actually, when she comes up.
Okay.
But I did want to sing her praises a little bit. She's done an excellent job for Prince William County over the past 12 years, along with her firm, PFM, which is the leading independent financial advisory firm in the country. And Ms. Carter, in particular, serves as the financial advisor not only for Prince William County, but quite a few jurisdictions throughout Northern Virginia and throughout the Commonwealth, and more recently here for NVTA. So her expertise is known and appreciated far and wide. And they have their finger on the pulse of the market and what other jurisdictions are doing. So I think she has some good information to share with you also.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so how do I blow it up again? Kidding. This is move ahead to the bottom one.
No, actually, use this to move ahead.
Oh, okay, this is the,
Just the point on.
got it. Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Good evening, Chairman, Vice Chairman, members of the board. Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you this evening. My name is Joanne Carter. I'm a Managing Director at PFM, and it's been the privilege of both myself personally and the firm to be engaged as the county's financial advisor for all these years. We have lived through some very interesting times with the county. I'd like to talk to 3 specific topics. First of all, provide some information that you all requested comparing the county's level of reserves to the reserves of your comparable peers, and by that I'm talking about a very exclusive and elite group of other AAA rated communities here in the Commonwealth and nearby. I'd also like to give you a sense of how the external stakeholders, the people who lend you money, the people who just lent you money at close to 3%, how they view your credit and the lens through which they view this question of reserves. I'd also like to take you through what I refer to as the AAA cautionary tales. And I have a number of examples, I'm not going to go through all of them with you tonight, of how we have seen through this most recent recession, which has been quite a clinic in local government finance for all of us in this business, what the importance of reserves really means and how rating agencies can move very rapidly to take action on credit when they see negative trends in reserves. And lastly, I'll conclude with some numbers. We are numbers people at heart. To give you a sense of what the dollar value is of these AAA ratings. I know at times it can seem abstract what it means, and so we like to put that into some real dollar values for you. I like to begin with the answer first, and so let me tell you what the bottom line message is, and then I'll take you through the detail. First of all, the county's reserves, when we compare them, and we use the Moody's database, which we subscribe to, which has all the information that Moody's Investor Service gathers when they rate communities across the country. When we compare you to a comparable peer group of other AAA rated entities, the county's reserves are consistent and in line with the reserves of others, and I'll show you that data. However, when we compare the county's reserve levels to AAA's nationwide, your reserve levels are lower, and I'll show you that information as well. Secondly, despite the many credit strengths here in Prince William County, the market views the county as having, yes, some credit risks. And part of the reason why this matter of reserves is so important is that when you do credit analysis, you look at a mix of factors. And so reserves is just one factor, and it's a strong factor that helps outweigh the risks that investors do perceive when they purchase your bonds and lend you funds to build your projects. And then finally, when you consider the examples we've seen through this most recent recession, and even a little bit before, of AAAs who have lost a AAA, in some cases several AAAs, there are some really clear lessons you can draw about what the consistent themes are and what the red flags are that the rating agencies are really looking for when they evaluate credit. Let's see. Thank you. Oops. There we go. Okay. So what you see here, using the Moody's database, we have charted the county's total general fund balance. Now, these numbers are different from the numbers that Mr. Martino just showed you because they're coming from the Moody's database, and they represent all your reserves, not just the two pieces that he just spoke with you. The bars is your history. You see the 7.5% along the bottom that he just spoke with you about. And the green line on this chart is where the peer group, which I'll show you in a moment, what their percentage of general fund reserves relative to revenues has been over the period shown. And you see the county's level of reserves relative to the green line, which is a peer group, is pretty consistent. And in fact, in fiscal year 12, the peer group median was at 18.4%, and the county is at 18.5%. And you'll see the peers in a minute and how they compare. The red line at the top is that same measure, general fund revenues to general fund reserves to general fund revenues for all nationwide AAA rated entities. The median is at 25.5%. Reserves are only one factor, but you can see nationally reserves are much higher for other AAA rated entities. Here is the peer group that I was referring to, and this is just a mix of other AAA rated entities here in the region. You see at least two of your neighbors here, Loudoun County, Fairfax County is here, and then some in Central Virginia. We threw a couple of Maryland, two Marylands and one North Carolina to honor our border states a little bit. They do have AAAs there. And what you can see is the green line is the peer group median, the 18.4%, and Prince William, the blue bar there, is sort of, right in the middle. Loudoun County is right next to you at 18.4%, and you see Fairfax County right here at 10.5%. So you see here too that while Prince William is consistent with the median, you, along with your peers, also maintain reserves that are lower than the median for a group of nationally rated AAAs. As you heard this evening, the county very successfully came through its most recent discussions with the rating agencies. What you see here, I'm not going to read them to you, are just some of the things they said about reserves in particular. I think it's fair to say that the rating agencies all view reserves as an important and relevant credit factor, and I'll get into some of the history on that, particularly as it pertains to Prince William in a moment. I know we're here to talk about reserves, but that's not the only thing the rating agencies focus on. There are four main areas, generally speaking, that the rating agencies evaluate when they evaluate your general obligation credit. They're your overall financial condition, your debt levels, the local economy and demographic conditions here, as well as your financial management approach. And my right, I guess you're right too, then this side of the slide shows you the risks, what's labeled as negatives. So you see it's not blank. There are some things when investors evaluate the county's bonds that they consider as risks when they lend you money. And most of them you see are here in the sort of economic demographic area. There's one thing for certain, and that is that the rating agencies are very closely monitoring how sequestration will play out over the long term. So there is some uncertainty there, and that's one of the reasons why you keep a lot of things in the positive column. The key strategy I tell all my clients in their rating agency relations is manage what you can to the absolute best of your ability, because there will always be uncontrollable factors that will impact your financial condition that you will just do your best to manage through. So manage the controllables. Reserves is one of those key controllables that you can manage, and acts as an offset to some of the risks that the rating agencies and investors perceive about the county's credit. So we've always known that reserves and strong financial performance, strong financial management are important to the rating agencies, and they lead to higher credit ratings across the board. The rating agencies have said this consistently in their publications. That's what you see summarized here on this slide. But what we have seen through the most recent financial crisis is firsthand how important reserves are in driving credit quality, particularly at the highest level, at the AAA level. There are 6 case studies presented here in this presentation. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to go through 3. I think the first one that I want to talk about is the experience that we went through with the county in 2008. When the foreclosure crisis hit Prince William in 2008, Fitch acted very quickly and assigned a negative outlook to your AAA. I remember that moment. It's one of those moments in your career you always remember. And when they assigned that negative outlook, they were very clear as to what they were looking for. And among the items that they indicated was an important factor that kept them from downgrading was the maintenance of sound reserve levels through the recession. And as you saw in Mr. Martino's presentation, reserve levels have continued to remain at strong levels. In the first report that Fitch released in April, it was July of 2010, regarding the county, when the outlook was returned to stable, so the negative came off and the stable returned, their very first statement in that report was, Prince William County has maintained solid reserves despite a weakened revenue environment that had been exacerbated by significant deteriorations in the housing market. That was the very first sentence of their report. And then they went on to say that maintenance of sound reserves and financial flexibility would be key rating drivers looking to the future. So very strong focus on this factor from the rating agencies within your own context here in Prince William. So I'd like to skip to slide 12, which is the DeKalb County, Georgia example. After several years of operating deficits and appropriation of fund balance to the point where their fund balance actually ran negative, DeKalb County not only lost their Moody's AAA, Standard & Poor's completely withdrew their rating. That's the rating agency equivalent of nuclear war. It is a really bad thing when that happens. And before they did that, they downgraded the county to BBB, which is basically right on the brink of being non-investment grade. The lesson from DeKalb County was that agencies can move very fast and outside the context of a borrowing at any time. Those ratings are there for hundreds of millions of investors who hold your bonds right this minute. So if the agencies see either negative or even positive trends, they want to be very up to date in communicating that to the investors who hold your bonds today. And so post the financial crisis, the agencies are even more vigilant about surveying the credit and making sure they understand what the regular budget decisions and those kinds of financial management decisions are going on in the county. The last example that I'd like to speak about is Montgomery County, Maryland. And similar to the other case studies that are included in the materials, one of the factors that really caused concerns, in this case it was Moody's, was the depletion of reserves to levels unbecoming of the AAA. As you saw earlier in the slides, the rating agencies have a lot of data that they track. And so part of their process is constantly benchmarking. Does one AAA look like another AAA within the region nationally? And they were very uncomfortable to the level of reserves that Montgomery County was reaching. And so in this case, Moody's gave Montgomery County a negative watch. A negative watch is different than a negative outlook, which is what Moody's just removed from your rating. A watch means that they will act within 90 days, a negative watch, to downgrade the credit. Among the various things that Montgomery County did to get that watch removed was they retooled their reserve policies. They changed their reserve at that time was 6%. They increased it to 10%. They removed caps that they had on their revenue stabilization fund. And they set up a long-term plan of mandatory contributions to their reserves that would take place over a long period of time. Actually, I believe their plan was to rebuild their reserves out to 2020. In the end, the situation was resolved favorably for Montgomery County. They were removed from negative watch. But even today, in the most recent report that Moody's released on Montgomery County, Maryland, they said that one of the factors that could, quote, make the rating go down, those are exactly the words they use, is a decline in reserve levels, further limiting financial flexibility. So even today, it continues to be a factor for them. So in closing, what is the value to you of your AAAs? The value to you is that you can access the market to build your project at reasonable costs. What we learned through the financial crisis that we have just come through is that that is not a certainty. In September of 2008, when Lehman declared bankruptcy, our market, the muni market that you all just very easily entered and exited with millions of dollars to build your projects just a short time ago, essentially shut down for 2 weeks. The first entity that was able to get back into that market was a AAA rated county, and it was one of your neighbors. And that's what the value is of your AAA. In the kind of markets that we're in, when instability is sort of the rule, it gives you the ability to get in to do what you need to do to continue to put dollars to your projects. Having said that, you can evaluate that advantage in dollars and cents. And what this chart shows you is it compares the various costs for different AAA rated 10-year general obligation bonds relative to a AAA. So if you have a AA rated bond, a 10-year bond, that rate would be around a 3.04%. If you had a single A rated bond, and again, a 10-year bond, that rate would be around 3.52. If you had a triple B rated bond, your cost would be over 4%. So you see, as you move along what we call credit spreads, your cost is higher. So how does this translate into dollars? So what we did was, using this information, we calculated, using the county's planned borrowing over its next CIP, which is roughly just over $800 million, what would be the cost of just a single notch downgrade to AA? Your estimated annual increase in debt service would be roughly $1.9 million, and that would be over 20 years. The county typically borrows over 20 years. And if we were to convert that 20-year stream of $2 million to today's dollars, it would be roughly $26 million in today's dollars. So I applaud you I was with the county when it attained its AAAs. And at the time, I think the advice I gave was it's going to be a lot easier to get the AAA than to keep the AAA. And I applaud you in keeping it and also having strengthened it through this most recent recession. That was not something that many governments can say that they have done, and Prince William has done it superbly. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. That's excellent. A couple questions, I guess. I was told that if the county, once after obtaining the AAA, loses the AAA, that it's more difficult to regain it than to have obtained it the first time around. Is that true?
Yes, it can be. I think that, and in part it depends on the reason for losing it. I think one of the things that's impossible for us to quantify, but is certainly an intangible that we observe in the marketplace is that AAA is about credibility and it's about reputation. And those are things you only lose one time.
And then secondly, you heard the conversation we had about the total reserves and whether we can reduce the revenue stabilization fund from 3.7 or 3.8 down to 1%. In your judgment, would that jeopardize our AAA status?
Reducing your policy levels? I just wanna be
Reducing
sure.
the actual amount that we have. Right now, we have 3 point,
Right,
Our five-year plan that we have
sure.
going down.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, so in your 5-year plan, you forecast the use of the Revenue Stabilization Fund, and I think that is perfectly fine. And you maintain reserves at or above your policy levels, and that's what the rating agencies are looking for, is that the policies that you have adopted and have been in place for many, many years, that you adhere to them. And that's what your financial plans, both the short-term and the long-term, do, and that's what they're looking for.
well, one of those graphs, though, that early on, you compared us to other jurisdictions, and you showed that we were right in the middle of the pack, or right where we're supposed to be. But if we reduce the revenue stabilization from 3.7 down to 1%, and we go below the median, I mean, is that a concern?
That doesn't concern me, because I think the one thing to bear in mind is that the discussion with the rating agencies is an ongoing, regular discussion, and they see those numbers, and they know what your planned uses are of those reserves. And yes, they will be benchmarking you against others, but I think within the context of your levels, your reserve policies are completely appropriate for Prince William County. So
Okay.
I don't think that you require a change to those policies, if that's what you're asking.
Well, I'm wondering whether, if we use some of those reserves, now that some of the instability in the economy has gone away, whether that's going to jeopardize it sounds like your answer is that that's a sound plan.
Yes.
Is to reduce the reserves down to that percentage.
Yes. Would you like to comment? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, the only other fact I want to throw in is, when we did the rating agency presentation, Ms. Casiato did present the 5-year plan and how we were going to be adjusting the revenue stabilization plan to all 3 rating agencies, and they did not have concerns
Okay.
about that process.
All right. Any other questions? Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Sure, I think we have the school board waiting for us, and I know there's a lot of folks in the audience waiting for us to deal with